So there's a little girl, a lovely little girl, and her mother. And one day the girl was holding these two apples, one in each hand. And her mom comes up to her and asks her, "Darling, could I have just one of those apples?" And then suddenly the girl just kind of looks at her mom really strangely for a few seconds. And then suddenly she grabs the apple in her left hand, takes a bite, takes the apple that's in her right hand, and then takes another bite. And her mom, looking at the girl, has this moment of complete disappointment that she's trying to hide, right, as she's looking at her daughter. Her face is frozen. She's disappointed. But then in the next second, the girl turns to her mother and says, "Take this one. It's the sweeter apple." Right? Yeah. So when I heard this story, it made me think, well, gosh, what if we recorded a video of what had just happened? And what if we had stopped it right there at the point where the girl took a bite out of both apples and was just standing there with both apples? What would we think? What would we judge about that girl? And then if we fast forwarded it to the point where the girl's handing her mom the apple, saying, "This is the sweeter one, have this one," what would we judge? What would we think about this girl? And now, of course, this is just a snapshot of the lives of these two people, right? If we were wound to a place that we don't even know the backstory, what would we think if we found out, for instance, that the little girl stole those apples? Right? What if the little girl and her mother were both starving? Would that change how we assess the situation? And I bring up this story because those of you who know me well know that one of my all-time favorite quotes comes from A Course in Miracles, and it's this: "It's not that we should not judge, but it's that we cannot." Because throughout our lives, we only have snapshots of one another, right? We only see these frames of each other's lives. We don't know the totality of information. And so it's not that we just should not judge because it's a bad thing to do. But what if we really came to this deeper realization that we know not enough to judge? What would that be like to live in a world in which we refrain from this kind of judgment? And by this I mean moralistic judgment. I talked about this several weeks back when we talked about nonviolent communication and this notion of radical communication that is based on non-moralistic judging. And I know for me that's totally contrary to everything that I was taught. Because even though I was raised in a Buddhist family, I was still impacted by a culture that is primarily traditionally Christian and that says that there is a punitive God out there. And so we need to be good and not bad. And so we need to evaluate our own choices and the decisions of those we love, especially, to keep them on the side of good and not bad. And then it came to be that incorporating this idea, it started to be that all decisions then needed to be based on this notion. Well, I want to do the right thing, right? I want my children to do the right thing. So I'm focused on this moralistic way of judging, good versus bad. And so the invitation I have, which is pretty radical, is the idea that if we take the premise here, that again, we are not innately sinners who need to be saved. We are not innately bad and we need to somehow earn our way into some heaven. But we're simply innately good and we simply need to wake up. Then maybe the framework of moralistic judging can be thrown out. But if it's thrown out, how do I know how to make the next best choice? What is it based on then, if not based on trying to be a good person? And so here's where this radical, again, idea is that we can cultivate what is known as divine wisdom or spiritual wisdom that allows us to make choices. Yes, we can call them judgments, but without that moralistic notion to them, they become more like discernment. Ways we ascertain what is that choice to be made. And as Victor's song so beautifully says, clarity can be found in the here and now. Right? As we open to this idea that we don't need to try to be good or try not to be bad, but instead can turn to something different, what we call wisdom. So the focus today is on what this thing is that we talk about here in Unity, which is wisdom. And, looking at the idea that some people seem to have more wisdom. How can we cultivate wisdom? And so that we have, the old notion, again, is that you earn your way into heaven. But here we believe that heaven is a state of consciousness in which we have a consciousness of oneness, of love, and of peace. And so the goal then is in every point choice in our lives, if we feel this wisdom bursting forth from us, this knowing, such that every step and choice we make in a place of knowing wholeness, perfection, peace, joy. Can we do that? That's the invitation of cultivating spiritual wisdom as taught in the 12 powers. So I want to begin by first sharing the idea that all of these 12 powers, we believe, are innate in each and every one of us. Though certainly, that's not the way we commonly treat some of these qualities, right? For instance, there's this wonderful quote that says, some people are wise, and then some people are otherwise. I love that one. And then some of us have this idea, like I know my older sister is a doctor, and I gotta tell you, when she graduated from med school, she looked like she was probably 18. So here's this girl walking in to your hospital bedside, and people are looking at her like, doctor? Like, are you going to, have the wisdom to treat me? Like, there are stereotypes. I know I come from a family in which there's a core stereotype in this Asian family anyway, that if you're old, you're wiser, and therefore deserve more respect, right? So our elders in our family are treated with great respect on the assumption that they're wiser and they have something to teach us. But in my personal experience, wisdom and age don't really necessarily match up. I know that like 10 years ago, when I was in the beginning of my spiritual journey, I had a lot of people mirror back to me, Nhien, you're wise for your age. And I thought about that recently, and I realized no one tells me that anymore. So I'm wondering if my age caught up with my wisdom. But yeah, so I love Tom Wilson said this, wisdom doesn't necessarily come with age. Sometimes age just shows up by itself. So, yeah. So let's talk about, if it doesn't show up with age, how does wisdom show up? How do we cultivate it? Of course, we don't have all the answers here, but this is one way that I've developed and worked on in myself here in Unity. The first thing I want to talk about with respect to wisdom is the process of unlearning. That wisdom, whereas the world's wisdom has a lot to do with learning from experience. It's sort of like you learn that when you come home late, your spouse is upset. It feels like a wise choice to try to come home on time for instance. It's through our life experience or prior knowledge that we feel like we're going to make wise decisions in the world. But I want to talk today about how it's actually a process of unlearning that is vital to developing what we call divine wisdom in our own being. The second thing I want to talk about is that the willingness to practice silence and listening to that still small voice rather than the voice of the multitudes around us, the voice of our parents, of our peer groups, of our colleagues, is essential to the establishment and expression of this profound wisdom in our lives, and thus joy and peace. And then finally, I want to share and invite my husband Victor to share a little bit about this too. The idea that has helped me in coming into a greater knowing of wisdom, which is this: my thoughts can lie to me. They can focus on the future, tell lies about the past, but my body, my present moment awareness holds in it a truth. Notably, wisdom and unity is located in the solar plexus, also known as the gut, right? That gut knowing that we're talking about. So I want to talk about these 3 points today. So the way of the world, again, is this way of acquiring knowledge. And a lot of times we'll talk about people as having common sense, right? Because they know how to operate in the material and experiential worlds. But wisdom takes a step away from what we think we know into a whole nother realm. And that realm is accessed by setting aside our predictions and our beliefs about the world. And the more we do this, in my personal experience, as well as in the experience of those I've talked to about this, we start to have moments of direct inspiration where we learn that we don't need to rely on anything in the world to teach us what that exact next step is. And one example of this is, as many of you know, when I was in ministerial school, the first year of school, I barely knew how I would financially make it through school. I had started with enough to make, 3 months of schooling, and then I kept, adding on a little bit more, getting little side jobs here and there. And then as summer approached, there was this big question looming about how was I going to make money to pay for my second year of seminary. I really had no idea how to go about doing that. Would I stay here in Missouri? I just started dating Victor. Was I going to leave? There were all these questions about what that meant for my relationship as well as my financial well-being, my ability to continue school. And I remember I did what I think many people I know do. I fretted for a while. And I wondered, and I looked up websites, and I looked up, legal document review places. I did my research. I asked people. I talked about it. I wondered about it out loud with friends and with Victor, and, what should I do? And what I noticed is this: a certain degree of spinning for me, historically, has to happen before I come to clarity. The spinning doesn't actually help with the clarity, but it helps kind of get my mind busy enough so that real inspiration can happen. I think it's kind of how I work. And it reminds me of how in the Sufi tradition, there's the Sufi turning. And I remember in ecstatic dance, people have talked about the fact that, oh yeah, sometimes we dance, we turn, so that it will shut our minds off. We will need to do the running abouts in the world, not because that's actually going to help us, but because that's the way we can sort of busy our minds so that we make room, or we at least placate our minds for a while. And so I did that for a bit until I was ready. And then what's interesting to me is I have always found this. I'll take a step back and say, I have a friend who does career counseling, spiritually based. And she's like, Nhien, it's just amazing to me how people will come to me and say, I don't know, I don't know what my next step is. And then they come and they proceed to tell me exactly what they know. Yeah. But what it took, she discerned, is the readiness to know. So again, a lot of this is not that we don't have the capacity to know in an instant what is ours. So I remember as I was swirling about, fretting, wondering, checking my email, did that doc review person reply to me? I just stopped. I stopped and I sat there and I allowed this base of experience and knowledge, these thoughts that came from the olden days, to start creeping up. And I realized that I had a limiting belief about life that came all the way back into my childhood, one in which my mother had made a choice, it seemed, between career and partnership, between love and thriving in her own life. And she made a choice that I felt was a limited choice. She sacrificed being a lawyer, it turned out. I never knew that she wanted to be a lawyer, for getting married, for her husband, for that relationship. And so I sat there a moment and I said to myself, I'm ready to unlearn this. I'm ready to let it go. I pulled out a journal and I started weeping. And I cried for all the ways in which this tension had been present my whole life between what was mine to do in the world and having a home life that was supportive. I became clear within that page. I wrote in that page what was mine to do. You're going to go home to LA and you're going to get a job and you're going to stay with your family. I had no idea my family was even in the mix here. But in that moment of release, it was like this wisdom greater than my own appeared for me. And then, only in retrospect, get this. I was on my bed crying tears. I mean, like, how your journal gets stained and the blue is like bleeding. And I'm looking at this and I cry and I go back to my laptop. And there was an email from Sony Pictures in LA looking for legal doc review folks. I mean, yeah, seriously. I got that job. I stayed at my sister's. And lo and behold, what that summer was about for me was healing with my family, as well as making big bucks as a lawyer, enough to pay for my whole next school year. So yeah, in that moment, when we are willing to unlearn an old story, usually a limiting story about what is possible for us, we create space, like on a blank page in a journal, for something new to arise, right? Unlearning. So even as you consider right now the next important choice that you're feeling called to make, I invite you to ask yourself if you've made room for the truth, if you've made room for a knowing about the right direction by having become aware of, conscious of, and then become willing to unlearn, to disbelieve something that was so true to you, that has been so true. If that choice happens, this is inevitably the result, right? So I encourage you to do that. The next thing is the willingness to listen. How many of us go to prayer and we're talking to God, telling him what we want, It's all about us and what we want. And how many of us also, though, go into that space with the burdens and the heavy load of the voices of what other people want for us. You know, some of that becomes internalized, right? And so that moment of clarity demands that we also be willing to set aside the voices of those who love us and those we love, to be able to enter into this space where that still small voice, which is so patient but so quiet, can speak to us. And we can hear that voice. And that demands that we be willing to live the ramifications of a decision that those outer voices telling us what to do or not to do, you know, that their disapproval is something we have to be open to, right? I even go back to the time when some of you know, I've been married before, and I was talking to my mother, the same mom who has all this great common sense to impart upon me. And I remember in this conversation with her in which she's like, when you get married, Nhien, your life is no longer your own. And I was horrified. And that's the weekend I decided to divorce my husband. But I realized I had made the same choice that she had in that moment, you know. But I knew also that I was going to be the first person in my entire family history, dating back to centuries in Vietnam, who got a divorce. So talk about, you know, facing outer disapproval in order to move through something so that which was in me and that which is true could live. And then finally, I'll talk sort of in present moment time now. I was reading a book on Vision Quest earlier this week, and it struck me how more and more now, as I become more and more willing to listen to this still small voice within me, and I can hear outer voices, but they actually sound more distant, that I'm starting to vibrate when I meet someone, when I read something that feels true to me. Like that is mine. Have you had that feeling before where you know something? You know, you meet someone and you know that this person is important to you. I read this passage and it was like my body was tingling, and it said, this is for you to do. You know, it has that in it. And you know, my mind can second guess, but it's like my body is in the present moment. My body knows. And so, ultimately, the cultivation of wisdom can be very practical, right? A lot of us want to be wise so that we can get what we want in the world. It's kind of like a kind of smarts. But the invitation here is to step it up a notch. This idea that if we have faith, if we have steadfastness in truth and in the knowing that infinite good is our destiny, then perhaps our wisdom faculty need only be placed not in a, hey, Spirit, I'm seeking you to give me guidance on how to get me what I want in the world, versus, Spirit, I'm seeking knowing so I can be and embody in this and in every moment the peace that you are, that I am in truth, that the kingdom of heaven that is in my midst can actually be present in my conscious awareness in any moment of any given day.